Okay, good morning and a very warm welcome to today's webinar from the UK Climate Resilience Programme. So my name's Kate Lonsdale and I'm one of the two champions for the programme along with Suraj Desai, and we're based at the University of Leeds. So this webinar series was set up to communicate the findings of research funded through the programme, although we're now also hosting a number of webinars on wider issues of relevance to the programme. So if you're new to the programme and would like to find out more about the aims, details of funded projects, latest news, or links to previous webinars and newsletters, please take a look at our website, ukclimateresilience.org. So the timing for today, so rough timings for today. Before we move on to the presentations, I'll briefly mention a few items of recent news. Then we'll move on to the focus of today's webinar, which is delivering resilience to climate-related impacts on water quality through Earth observation. And we're going to hear from Dr. Peter Hunter, so the work is based on work that he's led with his team, funded by the programme. But Peter is senior lecturer in Earth observation at the University of Stirling and has particular expertise in airborne and satellite data for water quality monitoring. We'll also hear from Professor Andrew Tyler, who is also part of the research team, and he will talk particularly about what this work funded through the programme is going to feed into, so the fourth environmental resilience array. Then we'll hear a response from Dr. Claire Neal on the relevance and value of this work to her work at the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, SEPA. So Claire's a senior scientist at SEPA and leads on Earth observation. So she's responsible for Earth observation applications and for regulatory monitoring. We should then have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and discussions, and all speakers will be available to answer questions. So I'm sure you're used to participating in webinars, and it's fairly straightforward. We'll have presentations, then questions and answers, and we're using the Q&A function for questions rather than the chat. So please add questions as they occur to you throughout the presentations. You don't have to wait till the end. We encourage you to upvote other people's questions, the ones that you'd like to hear answered. You'll remain muted unless I unmute you. We will share the audio and the slides a day or two after the event, and they'll be available through the YouTube link on our website. If you have a tech problem, please use the chat and we'll do our best to help you. And just to remind you, the webinar is being recorded. So I have three items of news. So we have the sort of final bit of funding through the programme is a cohort of the second cohort of embedded researchers. So this is a scheme where a host organisation and a researcher co-develop a research project on an area of mutual interest. So that's any area relating to climate resilience in the UK. And then the researcher is embedded within the host organisation as far as COVID allows to undertake the work. And this gives researchers the opportunity to understand the day-to-day working of the organisation and drivers and constraints on decision making in that organisation, and hopefully that will improve the impact of the resulting work. So if you're interested in that, more information is available on our website. Then there's a couple of Road to COP conferences coming up. So next week the Met Office is running their climate science conference, so the Science for a Resilient Future. So that's the 11th and 12th of May. So day one is focusing mostly on the latest scientific understanding of climate change challenges, and day two on assessing potential actions. The following week, for the whole week, so the 17th to the 21st of May, there's a week-long conference led by the COP26 Universities Network and the Italian Universities Network for Sustainable Development. And so each day there's a different theme. So they're addressing each of the 5 COP themes. So adaptation and resilience is on Thursday, and there's a number of people funded through the programme that are involved in that, including myself and Suraj. So that both of these conferences you can register now, and sort of more information in the agenda is available online. Yeah, and then finally a bit of wider news. So the Climate Change Committee has announced the dates of the launch of the third DCRA Climate Change Risk Assessment Evidence Report, so on the 16th of June. And they're running a webinar to do that, so that's a great opportunity to hear more about the latest scientific evidence for the UK, cost implications and priorities for the next 5 years. And also on the 24th of June is the publication of the progress report to Parliament from the Climate Change Committee. So let's move on now to the focus of today's webinar. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Peter Hunter. Welcome, Peter. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate, for the introduction, and good morning, and thank you to everyone who's joined this webinar remotely today. I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes or so presenting some of the results from our UK Climate Resilience project before then handing over to my colleague Andrew Tyler, who will then present the exciting next phase of our research in this area. But before I begin, I want to first acknowledge the wider project team involved in this work, and that includes Professor Lawrence Carvalho at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, Marion Scott and Claire Miller at Glasgow, and also our SME partners, 3DO, who are based in Northern Ireland. It's also important that I emphasise that this work is by no means standalone. Rather, it builds on the considerable achievements of previous research, particularly the NERC Global Lakes project, which also involved contributions from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory and the Universities of Dundee and Reading. So many individuals and communities will likely experience climate change primarily through the impact it has on water resources. And most obviously, this is going to be through increases in flood and drought events. But climate change will also affect water quality through elevated water temperatures and also through modifications to river flows and lake retention times. And these impacts on water quality are often an overlooked dimension of climate change. One of the most serious and let's say conspicuous impacts of climate change on water quality is likely to be increases in the frequency, duration and intensity of blooms of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria in fresh waters. So cyanobacteria are a natural and common occurrence in fresh waters, but they can rapidly form mass populations in warm and nutrient-enriched water bodies. And where these blooms occur, they not only pose risks to water security through, for example, impairment of drinking water supplies, but they also pose serious risks to animal and human health because many species are capable of manufacturing a range of potent biotoxins. So previous work by our project team has shown that lakes in the UK are likely to be vulnerable to climate-driven increases in algal blooms, largely through the effect of elevated water temperatures on growth rates, and also the effect of temperature on nutrient cycles. But it's also likely that we'll see impacts through changes in river flow and lake flushing as well during periods of drought. In this paper, which we published in Global Change Biology, we showed that lakes in the UK, particularly those north of 55 degrees latitude, are likely to be particularly vulnerable to such changes. However, our understanding of these impacts and the risks that they pose both to water quality and to human health is significantly hampered at the moment by the fact that monitoring is currently rather infrequent and often reactive. So many blooms are likely to go undetected, and obviously this hampers our ability to really quantify the effect of climate change on water quality and to take proactive measures to protect water supplies and human health. So the overarching objective of the project that we had funded under the UK Climate Resilience Programme was really to examine whether satellite data could be used to enhance bloom monitoring and to underpin a new climate service for the UK. So as part of the aforementioned Global Lakes project, we developed methods for remote sensing of water quality at global scales using ocean colour satellites. But these methods are not directly applicable to the UK because the vast majority of our water bodies cannot be reliably observed at the 300 metre or so resolution afforded by ocean colour satellites. So therefore in this project, we had to look at the kind of higher spatial resolution data provided by the likes of Sentinel-2 and its multispectral imager. So Sentinel-2 provides data at a native resolution of between 10 and 60 metres, which is much better suited to the scale of water bodies we have in the UK. But the MSI sensor on Sentinel-2 is more limited in terms of its spectral and radiometric capabilities, which required us to modify the existing approaches that we developed for processing data and for estimating water quality parameters. For example, the Sentinel-2 sensor doesn't contain a band in the orange part of the spectrum centered at 620 nanometers, which otherwise we can use to detect cyanobacteria through the biomarker pigment phycocyanin and differentiate them from other species of algae. So instead with Sentinel-2, we're sort of limited to trying to identify high chlorophyll concentrations as a marker of cyanobacterial blooms occurring during summer months. So through our climate resilience project, we built a new digital platform and processing chain, which we've named the UK Lakes Observatory. This slide gives you an overview of that processing chain that underpins the UK Lakes Observatory. I should say as well that Claire, who will speak a little later, was instrumental in developing the original processing chain that underpins this processing. I don't have time really, I don't think, to linger on some of the technical details, apart from to highlight that the processing chain employs an ensemble of chlorophyll algorithms, which are dynamically mapped to the type of lake under observation. And this allows us to adapt the processing to the spatial and temporal variability we see in the optical properties of lakes. So I'm not going to attempt a live demonstration of the portal, but I have embedded here a little video that shows some of its functionality. So you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen, this is the UK Lakes Observatory. So this initial map shows just the location of the lakes for which we process data. And currently we do that for about 900 lakes in the UK. And the user can basically toggle those lakes on and off based upon their current chlorophyll concentrations or their current trends. So you can isolate lakes, for example, where blooms are occurring or where water quality has been deteriorating over a period of time. The user can then zoom slightly. And at this scale, it then presents a UK-wide map that shows the water quality status of those 900 or so lakes across the UK, where the symbology shows both the concentration of chlorophyll A, that's the colour of the symbol, and the shape of the symbol shows whether we've been able to detect a trend over the recent period. And you can see there, for example, there's a few lakes in the Norfolk Broads at the moment that are showing a deterioration and potentially high concentrations of chlorophyll. The user can also then search for a lake. So here I'm searching for Alton Water, although initially I got a bit confused and started to search for Alton Towers. But when you search for that lake, you can then zoom in to the individual water body of interest. So you can see there I've brought up Alton Water. And at this level, you can start to visualize the data of that particular lake. So on the right-hand side, we've got a new dashboard. It provides some information about the water body, and that's information that's ingested from the UK Lakes portal that's managed by UK CEH. And then we can also then start to view the time series satellite data. So you can see there, I've unfolded a little plot that shows that these are the lake averages that are estimated through time. So this is the time series of how chlorophyll is changing in this particular water body. So as I scroll through there, you can see how the chlorophyll concentration has been changing over the archive of Sentinel-2, and you can identify bloom events. So you can see there's some high concentrations of chlorophyll observed part of the data series. And we can identify any of those individual points and then pull up the corresponding Sentinel-2 image that we've processed and estimated chlorophyll concentrations from. So currently we produce these data weekly, although we have the capability to move this process into daily if we so wished. And we also have the provision to issue real-time alerts to users should a lake of interest exceed sort of threshold concentrations. The algorithms that are implemented in the processing chain were trained and have been validated against available in situ monitoring data provided by both the Environment Agency and SEPA, and obviously Claire has been involved in this. And so this just shows a kind of sample of some of this validation work. So here we can see the estimation of chlorophyll, particularly in those eutrophic lakes that are most likely to be affected by blooms is pretty reasonable. That's shown in the bottom right plot there. So certainly when we isolate the observations in the so-called bloom season, which tends to run from sort of the middle of summer to early autumn, we've got a pretty good match up with the measurements that are made in situ. However, we do struggle to estimate chlorophyll in lower productivity lakes. But this is a known issue with Sentinel-2, and it's something that we're working on through other research projects. The comparisons are probably a little bit more interesting and informative when you start to compare the data at an individual lake level. So this is an example from Roscoby Loch in Angus, which again is a eutrophic lake with a long history of algal blooms. The monthly measurements here from SEPA are shown in red, and our Sentinel-2 estimates of chlorophyll are shown in blue. And then underneath the main plot, what we've tried to do is identify bloom events here in both time series by looking for values that exceed the 80th percentile estimated from the entire time series. So you can see that although we do underestimate compared to the monitoring data, and there's various reasons why that might occur, the satellite observations do a reasonable job of tracking the seasonal and interannual variation in chlorophyll. And you can see in that bottom plot, we also capture the majority of bloom events identified in situ monitoring data within a window of about plus or minus 1 week or so. And we can even detect some blooms before they actually appear in the monitoring data. So for example, that dense bloom in 2019 is a good example of how the higher frequency data from Sentinel-2 can really aid the early recognition of blooms. For balance, and because I'm from Cumbria, here's another example, in this case from S-rate water in the Lake District. So again, the satellite data show reasonable agreement with the in-situ monitoring data. And again, not only do we recognize the majority of blooms, but you can see again, we can identify some of these blooms before they would be captured in the in-situ monitoring data. So those results are really just a snapshot, and unfortunately I don't have time today to delve deeper into the data and some of the, I say, the spatial and temporal patterns that they show. But it is important to stress that the UK Lakes Observatory is very much in its infancy, and we are continuing to work on improvements to the processing chain and to reduce the uncertainties in the chlorophyll data and to improve the recognition of blooms. Currently, the UK Lakes Observatory and the underlying data are being evaluated by a number of stakeholders in the water environment sector, such as Nature Scottish Water, and of course SEPA, and Claire will say a little bit about that in a moment. And there are also some really interesting technological developments on the horizon, such as the launch of Planet Labs and use Super Dove nanosatellites, which offer potentially higher spatial resolutions, which will allow us to extend our monitoring to a wider population of lakes. And they also offer a band in the orange, which we might be able to use for detection of the biomarker pigment phycocyanin. One of the next phases of this research is to better integrate satellite data with other in-situ monitoring networks, such as the citizen science data from UKCH's Blooming Algae smartphone app. So this app not only provides complementary data to satellite observations and allows us to monitor smaller water bodies, but also it offers a potential for cross validation. And we're also looking to integrate the data into smart kind of IoT-based sensor networks, and this is something that Andrew will talk about in much more detail shortly. So finally, I'm conscious of time, just to summarize. So hopefully what we've demonstrated through our UK Climate Resilience project is that firstly, Earth observation can be used to successfully widen the surveillance of algal blooms and increase the likelihood of early detection. And we see this approach very much as being complementary to conventional and other novel monitoring approaches. It's not a replacement for lake sampling, but it can be used to greatly enhance both the quantity and quality of data that we currently collect. And ultimately, when employed operationally, the data provided by Earth observation has the potential to significantly improve our understanding of climate impacts on water quality in the UK, and to inform measures designed to build greater resilience against some of those effects. So I'll leave you with that little animation there on the right of the screen, which basically shows all the time series of bloom events in UK lakes that we've been able to detect from Sentinel-2 during this project. And on that note, I just thank you for your time, and I better hand back over to Kate.
Many thanks, Peter. So I'm going to hand straight over now to Andrew, who's going to tell us a little bit about what this work is going to feed into, a new project.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Just check you can hear me and you can see the slides.
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, Kate, for the introduction. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking to you about this next exciting phase of development that we're pushing forward in Scotland, and that's called the Firth Environmental Resilience Array, which builds very much on the technologies that Pete has described. And this platform is being developed to support that green recovery as a regional platform. And it is in partnership with British Telecom, as I'll describe in a moment, and is very much part of the city and region deal. For some reason, yeah, that's right, it's working now. Good. Investment that we have in Stirling, and that's building Scotland's International Environment Centre. SIEC really came out of an idea that I had largely when I was head of biological environmental sciences, and aware of obviously excellent research from our department and other departments, but also aware that we really need to drive impact in a way that hasn't been done hitherto, particularly when we start looking at the real challenges that we have around the climate challenge. So 6 years ago, with the emerging climate and biodiversity crisis, I was very aware that in fact, to drive change here, We can't do that from any one sector, not from academia or research institutions or from industry alone or from the government or policy, or indeed from communities. We really needed to bring these different sectors together to unpack the challenges within the climate crisis, and then also then co-develop and co-deliver solutions which are both palatable, sustainable, and effective across those different sectors to really affect change. And that's, since then, obviously, we can now describe as that sort of green recovery. And that, then those ideas were tested with SEPA and with Scottish Enterprise, and then pitched to senior cabinet ministers in both Westminster and in Scotland, Holyrood. And that resulted in an additional investment as part of the Stirling and Clackmannanshire City deal, the £22 million investment over 10 years to build Scotland's International Environment Centre. Now, originally, this sort of city deal development would be one which results in nice new buildings and laboratories and facilities, but in this post-COVID phase, I don't think there's any justification for new buildings. So what we're doing is pioneering and pushing forward in the development, essentially, of a digital twin to support a living laboratory in the whole of the Firth and Forth catchment. So hugely ambitious program of development here. So Fourth Era then is first and foremost the first implementation phase of SIEC, and it is built around the water because, as Peter's already described, we are feeling the effects of climate change through water, through extreme events, flooding and drought, but also those subtle shifts in terms of water quality, be it brownification or indeed to less desirable species of algae, cyanobacteria, harmful algal blooms in particular. But it's not all doom and gloom. Water also provides the solutions for that green recovery as well, in terms of energy recovery from kinetic or thermal energy recovery, or indeed from wastewater treatment works as well. Or indeed, if we look at the catchment, we manage our water much more effectively, then we can promote carbon sequestration and landscape peatland restoration, for example, the development of other sort of natural capital wetlands and so on within the catchment that promotes biodiversity as well as I said, carbon capture. But to be able to deliver on that, we really need to up our understanding of water and its flow through the landscape. And hitherto, our research in that water sphere has been somewhat compartmentalized by institutional bias or geographical bias, for example, or indeed through the demands of specific sectors or industry within the catchment, or indeed through our directives, the Water Framework Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Bathing Waters Directive, and so on. These have all somewhat compartmentalized our thinking. And yet we really need to have that holistic understanding of water and its flow through the landscape, so we can understand different types of interventions and their consequences and drive the efficiencies of how we interact with water in that landscape. So we're building on that Earth observation capability to give us that spatial perspective, so we can do the water quality as Peter's just demonstrated, but we will also use SAR so we can look at soil moisture within the landscape, so we can get a first shot of that continuum of water. And here we have an example of both SAR and Sentinel-2 data, I think from the 28th of May last year. So this is at a period of drought, so you can see sort of drier soils in the lowland parts of the catchment and the sort of wetter peatland soils in the upper part of that catchment as well. So we get that snapshot. That's great, but these are very dynamic environments, and we really need to augment this information with sensor data as well to give us that high temporal resolution data, partly to validate the satellite data, but also to bring in additional variables that we can't observe from space, such as nutrients or dissolved oxygen, for example, within the water. But then there's a fundamental question: what do we do between those observations so we have a fundamental better understanding of the landscape? So what we're doing then is bring the satellite data together with sensors so we can get that spatial perspective and get that temporal perspective. But what's happening between sensors at any time, and what's happening between the satellite overpasses again at any time. And so what we're doing here is adding in that sort of AI capability, that machine learning capability, so we can start predicting what's happening between sensors or indeed satellite overpasses, so that nowcasting capability in the landscape. In addition to that, then we're also building in sort of process-based hydrodynamic modeling so that we can think about what if type scenarios. What if we do this type of intervention in the landscape? Or indeed, what if we don't do anything? What are the consequences of climate change or other changes in the catchment downstream, for example? So that we really bring a sort of a data-driven approach so that we can have models running with data feeding into that to drive those models going forward in a way that perhaps just hasn't been achieved so far. So hugely ambitious to deliver on this, and that will deliver a huge amount of data. But what we need to do is also convert that data into knowledge, into intelligence to help drive that decision making. And the whole ethos here is about bringing the environment to the heart of decision making to drive efficiencies within industry, within manufacturing, as well as maybe drive better regulation and so on going forward. So that's fundamental, really. And so we're working with 3DEO, which is a data visualization company, to reimagine how we can bring that data intelligence to a whole range of stakeholders that we've been engaging with. So that then provides a platform for innovation. And we have had approaches from a number of sensor manufacturing companies now to use this as a platform to test sensors and innovation in that area as well. But as I said, fundamentally what we're trying to do here is bring the environment, the heart of the environment, that data to the heart of decision making, so better decisions, more effective decisions can be made in terms of how we utilize that water environment and how we minimize the impact on that, and fundamentally how we can drive that net zero carbon agenda as well. So there's huge opportunities in driving efficiencies, driving down carbon and driving down costs at the same time. And then collectively really build on that sort of growing resilience in the environment. So core to this, as I've mentioned, is British Telecom. British Telecom came on board as a core partner right from the start of, as we've started envisaging fourth era, bringing in that sort of Internet of Thing type technologies, but fundamentally the opportunity to start exploiting 5G digital technologies that enable us to maybe capture data from sensors that we haven't hitherto been able to achieve, but also process that and push it back out to stakeholders in near real time in particular. And we've been undertaking a huge amount of work with a whole range of stakeholders in co-developing this platform so that it is a real genuine value to help support those organizations. And I'll mention those very quickly in a minute. I'll skip over this very quickly, but basically what we're doing, as I say, is really trying to visualize the environment, building a digital twin using sort of gaming type technologies so that we can sit in the environment, bring in the intelligence of the environment wherever we are, so we can visualize variables that we can otherwise not necessarily achieve through existing technologies. I'll just move on because I see I'm running out of time. So we have a proof of concept that's being developed. We'd hoped that this would be finished actually last year, but COVID's intervened there, both in terms of sensor delivery, but also enable us to get out in the field, deploy sensors. It's now happening. So we have partnerships with Scottish Water in demonstrating this capability in terms of managing drinking water reservoirs, working with Diageo drinks industry in demonstrating how they're abstracting water, but also impacting warmer water into the environments and the impacts that might have, and demonstrating compliance. We're working with SEPA in particular in terms of demonstrating what's possible around bathing waters, as well as around flooding and droughts. And we've been talking a whole range of different organizations in terms of how this technology can help them in terms of habitat restoration, rewilding, dredging and shipping, the renewable energy industry, and so on. The fundamental underpinning all of this is about that green recovery, promoting that net zero carbon agenda, identifying where we can promote the environment, enhance the environment in terms of carbon sequestration, as well as promoting biodiversity. And there are next steps to this as well around air quality, etc., and subsequent phases. But I've probably run out of time, but this is just an example of a snapshot of the various organizations that we've been engaging with in the development of this platform. And then this is really resonating hugely across these organizations, all of whom have the similar ambitions around obviously the climate challenge and climate resilience and delivering on net zero and that green recovery. So working with community action groups, working with research organizations such as SOUS and CEH, for example, along with the statutory agencies and Scottish Water. And very quickly, This has resulted also in substantial additional investment. So building on that 5G capability, we've now secured investment in a new innovation hub, 5G innovation hub around environmental sensing. Scottish Water have now invested as well, £3.5 million, and we host the Scotland Hydrogenation Chair, which is really building on all of this and also bringing the Scottish community, the water sector together to deliver on net zero, deliver on that circular economy opportunities, as well as promoting that enhancement of the natural environment. Nature Scot, we're building case studies with them around peatland restoration, water quality, salt marsh restoration as well. And with SEPA, as already mentioned, around flooding and drought. We're now leading the water component of the Leven program, which is a program led by SEPA, working with the local communities in terms of how we can promote that sort of green recovery within the Leven catchment as a sort of microcosm of what we're doing. Working with community action groups as well. We're also now on the Leadership Council of the UK Water Partnership as well, and helping to drive on that digital water component there in particular. And we're also forming a partnership with the World Water Quality Alliance of the United Nations Environment Programme, which has taken this capability and taking it internationally. And I think I'll stop there. So probably exceeding my time. Apologies.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Andrew, and yeah, a very impressive overview. And so thanks to both Peter for introducing the funded work and to Andrew for showing this amazing initiative that the work's going to feed into. It looks very impressive. I definitely want to follow what happens with that. We're now going to get a response from Claire Neal. So Claire leads on the Earth observation work at the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her what's come out of the research that has value for her work.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Claire Neal and I lead on the Earth observation technologies at SEPA. So today I'm going to give you just a really quick whistle-stop tour about how SEPA are using satellites to provide further evidence for environmental and regulatory monitoring, and also how we're using the data that's been generated through the University of Stirling and the projects that you've just heard to inform decision making. So you'll be aware that SEPA are Scotland's environmental regulator, and we have a really important role within Scotland, and this can be split into these three sort of primary functions. So first of all, we're charged with protecting and maintaining or even improving the environment. We're also responsible for regulation and ensuring that businesses and organisations are complying with environmental regulations. And last but not least, we're also responsible with warning the public in the event of any environmental incident. So that could be a biological incident or a flooding incident. It's SEPA's responsibility to inform the public. So as you can tell from these three core functions, we need data, we need monitoring data, and essentially we need good data. So that monitoring data has to be provided in a timely manner. It has to be reliable in terms of the accuracy and availability, and it also has to be consistent across space and time in order for us to fulfill those three primary functions. So we collect data from a number of different sources. Up until this point, we've relied heavily on traditional methods such as sampling, where we take direct evidence from a specific location. And this has produced data sets that span, 50 plus years. And these are really essential for understanding how the environment's changing and how that's changing in that sort of mid-term time frame. And that, again, is across space. So whether that change is global in a sense, or if it's geographically specific. We're now looking more recently at collecting more digital information. So that could be modelling, either machine learning, artificial, or just physical modelling, remote sensing, and also sensor networks. So we're looking at these new sources of information to give us the capabilities to fill gaps in our past data sets, to optimise what we're doing in the present, so to provide that additional information that informs decision making. And it also will give us these capabilities to predict the future. That's in terms of any of these environmental parameters through scenario testing or machine learning modelling. It's really important to stress, as Peter did, that we're not suggesting we're going to replace standard practices, but actually what we're looking at doing is combining all of this information, sort of like a jigsaw puzzle, which holds each of the individual approaches. And what we're looking to do with this multi-layered, multi-dimensional approach is to complete or to generate a complete digital environment. And this really provides us what should be the holy grail for any data-driven organisation, which is the opportunity to produce and use neutral, independent, non-biased, and much more representative data. So that's what we're trying to achieve by combining these multiple data sets to really give us a better understanding of the environment and the intricate relationships between how water is used and the impact that has on the environment. So we have some early achievements in creating a digital environment. The first one was in collaboration with Glasgow University, and it was funded through the NERC Constructing a Digital Environment Fund. So it was a project on the Elliott water catchment where we layered sensor networks with satellite data to produce a tool which provided information for farmers as to when to irrigate for optimising their crops. We also are working closely with Stirling University on the fourth ERA project, which you've just heard from Andrew, which is a similar approach of multi-layering those different approaches. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the examples of products that we're upscaling from those digital environments to inform decision making. So the first one that comes directly from fourth ERA is flooding. So we're looking at using SAR imagery to produce maps of water pixel probability. So that will give us each individual pixel, whether or the probability as to whether or not there is water there. And this means that we would be able to produce for the first time flood risk maps that are based on real observed data and not just models. Off the back of that, we're also looking at drought and the impact that has on soils. So again, this comes from the soil moisture product from fourth ERA, where we're assessing saturation across the whole of Scotland. And we're also combining that with land classification to allow us to identify regions of bare soil. And this gives us a real powerful tool that lets us optimise land management either for agriculture or flooding. So off the back of the UK Lakes portal, we're using the data from that portal to provide evidence for lake health. And this is specifically with the Water Framework Directive in mind. So this data set of Sentinel-2 data for all of the water bodies in Scotland give us an opportunity to quantify and really visualise trends and change across space and across time. And it allows us to fill gaps in our time series, our sampling time series with the satellite data. And this can provide additional evidence in the absence of sampling, which is particularly important during times such as the COVID pandemic, where sampling was restricted. We're always looking at the next step, which is combining information related to cyanobacteria derived from satellites. And this essentially will give us the complete Water Framework Directive phytoplankton metric that's required for the directive reporting. In a similar fashion, we're using a really similar approach to map the chlorophyll dynamics in the coast. And this is for our aquaculture work streams. So we're using baseline maps to really identify regions that are a particular risk of environmental or regulatory events. This gives us an opportunity for strategic monitoring, so we can go to places where we know something is happening. And it also gives us this immediate resource that allows us to backtrack and identify where events have happened, and we haven't sent someone out for sampling. So I just want to finish by saying, this is a collaboration, and it's a collective effort that's required to ensure that these digital applications remain sustainable. So SEPA are already working with a number of organisations who are interested in using satellites for similar applications, whether that's in the public sector or with other universities. And really we have to keep that collaboration, it's key as we move forward and upscale the projects that Andrew and Peter have already described. Thank you.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Claire. So we have a few questions coming in, and just so I'm going to encourage people to write some questions, and while they're doing it, I'm just going to ask a question of my own. So has this approach enabled you to learn very much about sort of new or any surprising new sources of pollution? So in the ways that you've monitored these lakes, is there anything coming in that surprises you about sources? Or was it roughly what you expected?
I wouldn't say a surprise. You know, we're still in the process at the moment where we're really getting to the nitty gritty, getting to grips with the data. What we have learned is that you can quite easily look at the images or the examples from the satellite and really have more of an idea of where things are coming from. So, you know, if it's anthropogenic or if it's more climatic. So it just gives you that kind of extra bit of information that allows you to make decisions. So the decisions in most cases at the moment are not related to the directives, but they're for that strategic monitoring. So, you know, we're using these satellite images to say, okay, we think something's happening here. It's close to the coast, so we think it's anthropogenic. So we're going to send somebody there to take a sample.
Right.
So that's what we've been using it primarily for at the moment. But yeah, it's really exciting. And when we get to grips with the data, I can foresee, you know, the importance of how we're going to use it.
Brilliant. Yeah. Is there something you'd like to add, Peter or Andrew? Oh, surprises.
I think what we've experienced elsewhere is that I can think of some stories. I won't name which countries, but that often you know, water bodies may be monitored from a single point from sampling, and maybe given good ecological status. But actually, when you get that spatial perspective, that may be not the case. I think there's a few examples of that.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think in the UK at least, we probably have a reasonable idea of which water bodies are at risk of algal blooms. You know, I think we've probably got a pretty good understanding of those sites. But what the Earth observation capability does is increases our ability to monitor them and identify when blooms occur, because obviously bloom events can appear and disappear within a space of a few days, and if you've only got monthly monitoring, it's quite easy for those blooms to go unnoticed. So even in the sites where we know there's a risk of blooms, there's a potential of using satellite data to get a better handle on how frequently those blooms occur. And then, as Andrew just alluded to there, obviously outside of the UK, you know, very few water bodies are routinely monitored. So we have very poor information about which of water quality at a global scale and which sites or water bodies are subject to bloom. So Earth observation gives us that ability to surveil all those lakes where we currently have absolutely no data for.
And I guess the phenology also, that's the other thing that you've been looking at, particularly Peter, and getting a new perspective, actually how climate change is impacting on water bodies in shifts in when blooms are occurring. Yeah.
Yeah, that's some work we've done previously as well. In those lakes where you have the ability to obtain frequent data from Earth observation, so those areas where they're slightly less cloudy, you can build up quite detailed temporal time series of bloom events and chlorophyll concentrations, and you can then use that to look at the phenology of blooms and, for example, see whether not just a change in frequency, but a change in the timing of those events as well. Are they starting to appear early in the year because of climate warming and these sort of things? So we have seen evidence of that in some water bodies that we've looked at.
Okay, thank you. Right, so there's a couple of questions. I know, Andrew, you've already had.
Sorry, I see. I shouldn't have done that. Apologies.
I'm going to ask them because in case Peter and Claire have additional things to add. So actually, this one was directed directly at you. So how do you envisage the digital twin framework to work? Are there examples of systems that you've already modelled with the digital twin, and what benefits does the digital twin modelling have over less holistic modelling strategies?
So I think there are other examples of digital twins, and the whole concept of digital twins, I think, probably needs to be defined more more carefully, because I think it's being used in a whole range of different contexts. But yes, and then there are examples of, from Leeds as well, I think, in terms of digital twins being developed of urban environments and water flows, I think. And there are digital twins of more detailed manufacturing processes or processing of water, etc. But here we are putting together a very ambitious program of really understanding that full continuum of water flow. And that does need, a joined up thinking of bringing together existing modeling type strategies to understand that flow through the environment. So it is hugely ambitious, and there's a lot of work to be done there, and not to be, underestimated. So sorry, do you remember what the rest of the question was?
What benefits does the digital twin have over less holistic modelling strategy?
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing is that we have that holistic understanding. So we do need to understand, what if you do something in the headwaters? What are the downstream consequences? And having a small compartmentalized model of one part of the system, you can't think about what the downstream literal and metaphorical consequences are of that intervention. So it's really important that we now have a more detailed understanding of the whole catchment and how it's operating from real-time data, as well as that data feeding models and driving those models.
Okay. So how would the team plan to apportion impact of anthropogenic activities versus climate change on water? So this is perhaps more relevant in the context of developing countries where poor regulations can cause much significant impact as compared to climate change.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Priyanka. So the Global Lakes project that Peter's been mentioning, we have looked at 1,000 lakes around the world, for example, and collected data on how the catchment's been changing, as well as how the climate's been changing, and within the catchment, population change, land cover change, etc., and built up a global database to look at that. It's a difficult one, trying to find those associations, statistical associations to identify what the drivers are. Sometimes there are a mixture of drivers, obviously. So working at a global scale, that's one thing that has huge data challenges. Bringing it down to the catchment or individual lake scale, you do need to reconstruct as much data as you possibly can, and then you provide the evidence. But that's not a straightforward question. I think it needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Anyone else wants to answer that one?
Yeah, I can come in there maybe. Yeah, I think you made some good points, Andrew. I think it's really important that we don't see lakes as just being isolated systems in a landscape. And perhaps when you look at the data on the UK Lakes Observatory, it gives that impression because that's how we produce the lakes, the lake data. But as Andrew mentioned in the Global Lakes Project, what we also did alongside producing water quality data for those lakes was to produce information on catchment characteristics for those 1,000 or so water bodies, and allowed us, obviously with that kind of size of data, to attempt to tease apart some of the effects that are driven by, say, catchment changes in land cover and population versus those that might be driven by climate. And that's something that certainly we would look to replicate with the UK Lakes Observatory going forward, is in terms of we don't just provide water quality data, but we can also provide relevant information on the catchments for those water bodies as well. It's probably also important just to note, though, that obviously one disadvantage of Earth observation is certainly with things like Sentinel-2, is a relatively short time scale or time series that we have of data from those missions. So obviously when you're trying to tease apart climate effects from catchment scale effects, you really need a longer time series maybe to disentangle some of those those different drivers. And at the moment we've just got 5 years or so of data from Sentinel-2, but obviously those are long-term missions, and when they extend out to 2030, we'll have a much better time series to attempt to answer some of those questions.
I guess the other quick point to make is if there is an intervention in the environment which it has an impact, we could potentially see it. So in near real time, obviously, if there's a change in land cover or deforestation, or what's happened resulting in erosion, sediment flux or nutrient flux, then the consequences of that is something we potentially pick up as a hotspot of change within a catchment as well, at least in terms of coming into a lake environment.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a question here about what is the approximate proportional contribution of climate change relative to other contributing factors like non-point source pollution towards water pollution on a global scale?
Very good question. So again, that's actually, we're currently working on a paper to look at that. Right. And it does depend, obviously. It depends where the lake is, what the water body is, what the catchment is, the population density of that catchment. It does vary hugely. And you know, the role of temperature, for example, in terms of, you know, the impact on that lake as a result of climate change depends on the morphology of that lake as well, whether it's a deep or a shallow lake. So these are quite complex issues, but there is as I say, we are drafting a paper at the moment. It's been quite long in its gestation period, but it's coming out of the Global Lakes data set that we've been mentioning. Which will actually demonstrate the different components, what controls that differential sensitivity of lakes to change, basically to drivers of change, be it from sort of human-induced change or climate-induced change. And and I'm sorry, and it's a typical scientist's answer, it depends. And it does depend on the lake morphology, the catchment characteristics, where it is on the planet, as well as you know, what our impacts have been. But that will be distilled nicely, hopefully, in that paper.
Anyone else want to contribute?
Yeah, and just say, I guess at the at the UK scale, the predominant control is nutrients. It's nutrients that drive algal blooms in the main part, and to that extent maybe changes in flow and flushing rate as well. So the kind of climate signal, I guess, is superimposed on top of that, and what probably we've seen to an extent over recent decades in the UK is an improvement in water quality as a result of things like the Water Framework Directive. But I think there is that potential that climate change, if it does result in increased water temperature, prolonged stratification, low flows, it might start to offset some of those improvements that we've made in water quality in some parts of the UK. And I imagine that's a situation that will be replicated in other parts of the world as well. Although, as Andrew said there, you know, the drivers of algal blooms and water quality more generally can be quite varied depending on the type of lake and obviously the geographical region.
Okay. Great. I think we've got probably just time for one more question, and it's about the role of citizen science. Like, so Peter, you mentioned the Blooming Algae app, and that there's going to be a sort of linking of that app with the work. And I'm also interested to know, well, partly about what's the quality of that and how do you sort of validate it, but also how do you bring in citizens data in SEPA, and how might you bring it in the full era work?
Great, and I can start. So we actually did some of this as part of the UK Climate Resilience project. So we did some comparisons between bloom events observed in the satellite data and those reported through the Blooming Algae app, which was developed by Lance Carvalho and colleagues at CH. And we did see to some extent reasonable levels of agreement in those lakes that had citizen science records, and we were able to observe from space. The key advantage of combining the two approaches is obviously there's a limit to the size of water body that we can see from space and for which we can produce accurate data. So citizen science is one route to obtaining additional data from those smaller water bodies, and often those water bodies, although they're small, are important because they might be frequented by lots and lots of people. So that's a way of extending, I think, the observations that we get from space. And what we're probably looking to do as we move forwards is integrate those two. So, for example, pull in the satellite data from the UK Lakes Observatory into the Blooming Algae app, and then the citizens can have a go at validating some of those observations. So if we've observed a bloom event in the Sentinel data, citizens can confirm whether there's a bloom visibly apparent on that particular water body.
Just coming quickly, so we're also partners in a European Horizon 2020 project called Monocle, which is actually led by partners at PML. And that is actually exploring technologies that citizens could implement in terms of water quality monitoring, partly to satisfy, sort of provide some satellite validation work, but also to fill the gaps in terms of observations, for be it temporal resolution or spatial resolution. So there we're working with partners across Europe, including Earthwatch, who have developed these sort of test kits for looking at water quality, be it concentrations or coliform concentrations. And they do actually seem to be being reproduced quite well. And we've had a number of case studies with that, both in Loch Leven in Scotland, Lake Balaton in Hungary, and at the moment in Lake Tanganyika as well in Africa. And that does seem to be working really well. We're also working with a number of SMEs around smartphone gadgets to actually use the optical phone, the camera on the phone to look at water quality, but also atmospheric aerosols as well, critical for atmospheric correction. And then to slightly moderately more expensive instrumentation for deploying to looking at remote sensing reflectance above the water, again for helping us to validate our data. So there are some interesting technologies of a range of costs that could be implemented quite effectively, actually, within a sort of citizen science type opportunity.
Okay, great, thank you. And final word to you, Claire, is how's SEPA thinking about citizen science?
Well, we're involved. We're involved with the blooming algae work as well. So there's some people at SEPA who are responsible for confirming or denying whether or not there is an event. So it's all interconnected. So SEPA are always kind of there hanging around behind the scenes as well. But yeah, anything, as I say, any kind of approach that gives us those multi-layered information tools, then yeah, we want to be involved.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we've come to the end of the session. So I'd like to say many thanks to our speakers. So Peter, Hunter, Andrew, Tyler and Claire Neal, thank you so much for answering all these questions and for your presentations. So I'm just going to quickly share the screen to do a quick plug for our next webinars. So we have these webinars every couple of weeks. So the next one, unfortunately, the person who was meant to be speaking then had to pull out, but we have got in place and we're currently developing a webinar on the Race to Resilience initiative. So you'll get an overview of the Race to Resilience and the implications for the UK. We've got speakers, but we're just sort of fine-tuning the title, and the registration will be available shortly on our website. And then on 2nd of June, Murray Dale, who's doing some work currently for the programme, will be talking about climate services, so defining standards for climate services and monitoring how you can value climate services. So it just remains for me to say thank you again very much to Peter, Andrew and Claire for your input today and for everybody's questions. It's much appreciated. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, Kate. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.